Hi, I'm Jack Santos. I am the chairman of the board here at the Custom House Maritime Museum. In the back is James Russell, our executive director. Say hi to James. You're on your way out. Great job. And we are recording this on YouTube, just so be careful. It might pick up whatever you're saying about your neighbor. And it will be live on YouTube. I'm so pleased to have our guest speaker here today. Before I introduce him, let me just highlight a couple of things that are happening here. First Friday is back on for the First Friday schedule in March, and we'll have Tim Kendall, who's going to be talking about the ship Huguenot that was captained by Captain Alexander Graves, struck by lightning at sea in 1846. And he'll be giving us a story about the painting that was lost and found and then presented to the Custom House Maritime Museum. St. Paddy's Day, James is, I think, leaving in a few days for Ireland to get some material for his St. Paddy's Day talk, which will be March 17th at 2 p.m. right here, at our annual members meeting, which will be March 21st at 7 p.m. right here. So that's kind of an overview of things that are happening. I'm so pleased that David Tory agreed to come down and speak to us. This is his first time here at speaking at the Custom House Maritime Museum. I don't know how many of you know Ann Easter Smith, local Newburyport, historical fiction author. Ann has since moved on and lives in Florida. Shame on you, Ann. She'll be watching this on YouTube. But she actually had called me one day about a year ago and said, Jack, you have to read these books. I know about your interest in history, and there's a fellow down in Ipswich who was my childhood friend, and we've lived in two bordering towns for so many years, and we had no idea that we were both here, and they reconnected, and Ann recommended his books to me. 2 weeks later, I came out of my cave totally enthralled about the story. The story that David has written. It's just fantastic. The books are for sale in the store. They're called the Stanfield Chronicles. The first one's Exploration. The second one's Retribution. And the first thing I asked David before he joined us today, even before I said hello, is when are you getting the third one out? When are you getting the third one out? It's a great historical story set in the North Shore from before the time the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth into the 1630s and 1640s and beyond. So I highly recommend it. David, I was so enthralled with David and his books that I told him I've got to meet this guy. And we sat down for coffee about 6 months ago in Ipswich. And we found that we had a lot more in common than just our interest in history. David spent 35 years in technology. I think I had you there. I might have been around 40 or 45 years. And he was he was selling my company software, so we were on the opposite sides of the technology business. He founded after he left that, he founded the Essex County Community Foundation in Topsfield, Mass. He saw a need for a foundation on the North Shore similar to what had been done in the South Shore to help nonprofits raise money and be a source of funding. And that kind of awakened him to the history richness of the region. And he wanted to make sure that there was philanthropy around to help us continue to explore that history and enjoy it. After retiring from that, he went into researching history, kind of like what I do. He's much better at it. He's published books. These stories are fantastic. They're historical fiction. But I'm reading it, I say, wow, he's got all the facts right. So it's really worth reading those if you're into that. He's also a sailor. He's had a boat. He spent 30 years sailing with his wife, and they're in love with the coast of Maine. They currently live in Essex. So welcome, David Tory. I don't like using a microphone. Can you hear me at the back?
Yes.
Yes.
If it's not mumbling, just sort of tell me I'm mumbling or something. Well, now, first thing I should actually ask is, has anyone here actually heard me speak before? That means I can start from the beginning and I don't have to worry about repeating myself. That's wonderful. Firstly, let me talk a little bit more about myself. I've actually, by the time Jack finished, I was going to say, well, are there any questions?
I have that reputation.
Yeah. As Jack said, I was in the computer business. This actually has relevance as to why an old fogey like me actually ended up writing a book, getting into writing novels. When I started in my computer business at 62, I was programming computers that took the size of this room and basically had no power at all. And being in the computer industry, I found that I was never able to do any research because everything was in front of me. I mean, computers were expanding. There was nothing behind me to do research on because I was working on very early computers. And so moving forward all the time, you were constantly trying to keep up, not do research. So, and I never went to university. My father said, "University of life, my boy." And that's what I did. So the idea of doing research, which was an important part of sort of where I am now, came to me sort of very new. And in fact, I came to it, luckily, with the internet being available, which obviously wasn't available when I was going to school many years previously. So that was important. The other thing that was important is that I had started a company selling software products very early on. And those products hadn't been very well packaged, if you like. So I was doing a lot of writing. I was writing how-to manuals, which were factual, and marketing material, which perhaps wasn't quite so factual. And this continued on, and I did it all the way through. Even when I was an executive vice president of a large software company, I was still finding I was doing writing, telling people, laymen, how technical things worked. And that was an important part, again, of my education in writing. But again, primarily that was just part of the job. I was doing the job, but I was very comfortable writing. Hunt and peck on the keyboard. Never learned to do it more than that. So my background really led its way towards research and writing, although that had never been my intent. When I left the company I was running in Cambridge in '95, I then got into philanthropy through my wife, who started a non-profit in Lawrence, and I helped her, and then that morphed into me helping other organizations, and then that morphed into the Community Foundation. I left that in 2011, determined to find out why it was so difficult raising philanthropic dollars in New England, compared to a lot of my colleagues in the industry said that you had it rough up there because you've really got to work hard to get the Yankees to delve their short arms into their very long pockets. And anyone who's in a non-profit business knows how difficult it is to sort of keep the lights burning. So I thought what I would do would be to write a thesis. Having been in university, I thought that was a very grand idea. Write a thesis about philanthropy in New England. And the first thing I being very astute, I thought, well, it must have something to do with the Puritans. The Puritans being unique, if you like, certainly in terms of the early settlements, unique to this part of the world. And there seemed to be a coincidence between the Puritans and this I give of myself, but not of my wealth approach. So I started doing that research. And the more I did the research, the more I came upon things that I didn't know. Now, I obviously can tell from my accent that I'm not local. But the history of settlements in America, New England, they were we learned a lot about it at school because it was the English side. What did we do wrong? that we ended up losing the colonies. And so it was that aspect of it. It only went so far. But the more I read not only from the American perspective and American sources, but also from the English sources, I realized, in fact, that there was a story here that really hadn't been told very well. I read, have anyone read Nathaniel Philbrick's Mayflower? It's a wonderful book. And that really set me going because it told me a lot about the Mayflower, but it didn't tell me a lot why. Being in the computer business, you always want to know why did this happen, because I want to make sure that if I write a program that duplicates it, I've got all everything covered. So I really wanted to know why did that happen, and who was that influenced that to happen. And I found also that, to a large extent, the history over here, it sort of starts with the Mayflower, starts in 1620. Well, an awful lot happened before that, which led to the Mayflower. And then they said, well, it's the Pilgrims. Well, the Pilgrims weren't called Pilgrims until the 1800s. They were Separatists and Puritans. Everything sort of started from there and moved smoothly on. And I've talked to various schoolmaster friends of mine, both at the secondary level and at the tertiary university level. And the problem here is that we Americans have not only got to learn about our American history, we are taught at school about world history, and European history, and English history. And then only latterly do we have time to talk a little bit about what actually happened to us. So yes, well, 1620, Mayflower, that's good. Oh yeah, before that, Columbus arrived sometime or other, I can't quite remember. Then 1776, something important happened, and then we get into the Civil War, the 1860s, and then we get into the First World War. And they said, we don't have the time to actually explore what really went on behind a lot of these things, a lot of the incidental things, which led to more consequential things, which led to things which we do remember. And it's a terrible, it's a blight on our academic program. They're telling me that we just don't have the time to explore all the things that are so interesting about why things happened and who they were and what everything went on. So that to me was fascinating, because very quickly I realized as I was doing my research that this was a story to be told and not just a philanthropic thesis or treatise or whatever. And I then delved further and further into the history, and of course, not being disciplined about my research, not having been taught how to do research, I went down innumerable rabbit holes, exploring and getting involved and finding things on the internet. If you go far enough, you've got everything. Everything has been digitized as far as I can see. There were documents, they said you can't get hold of that unless you're a member of some very august body. But I went and dug down into the internet and I found that I could get a copy of it without a problem. So again, every now and then, in business, one of the things you have to do is learn very quickly when you're in business planning is not to get into sort of mission creep. You've got a plan, you've got a mission, don't do something else and spread your capability to do it. I found the same problem in writing. If you're doing research, you say, well, that's a very interesting thing, maybe I should bring that in. No, that's a I could do that too. But you've got to keep bringing it back so it works. So what happened was that I ended up with something like 400,000 words of notes and writing and everything else. And I talked to friends of mine, including my very good friend Jack Armitage, who's one of my key editors. And he said early on, this is a story that needs to be told. Why don't you create a curriculum for it at school? And that's why I had a problem with school teachers saying, yeah, very nice, but we don't have the time. And then we said, write a book. And I then said, well, how do I write the book? What should I do? Do I just write a history? And then I said, well, I want to explore various things that have not come out in history, which I might not be accurate, but they certainly fit the process of deduction that I came to. Well, that happened and that happened. What happened in between? Maybe this is what happened in between. So the whole idea, I think, of writing a factual story sort of dimmed a little bit, because I never really wanted to let facts get in the way of a good story. I wanted to be able to tell a story and not worry that an historian would turn around and say, "That's wrong. You've got it wrong." And I'd say, "But it's fiction." That's all I can do. So I then said, "Well, all right. What I'll do is I'll start writing, but I need to write. I want to write it with a degree of immediacy about it." So I said, "I'm going to write it as if it's a first-person narrative. And if it's a first-person narrative, where that person, the narrator, his name is Isaac Stanfield, a fictional character, he has to be involved. He has to observe. He has to know who the people are, get to know the people, be a part of the events, and observe the events, and even better, participate in those events as well." So that was good. So I thought, well, when do I start? Where on earth does one start? Because if the first important thing one had to do was write about essentially the Mayflower, that's the seminal thing that happened. Mayflower arrives in November of 1620, and then everything goes from there. I said, well, all right, so what I will do, the first book will be about the Mayflower, but it won't be talking about the Mayflower and going on the ship and everything else. It's what happened that caused the Mayflower to leave Plymouth, England, and sail across. So the first book ends with the Mayflower leaving Plymouth Harbour in Devon, in England, on its way across the Atlantic. So the book starts really before that, and I'll explain that in a minute. So what I next want to do, and I've got to be careful of time here, what I next want to do is just talk a bit about history. Imagine, if you will, the east coast of the United States in around 1605. Of course, you know that very well. It's essentially the shoreline, if you like, it's the coast of North America, from Canada, Newfoundland, all the way down to Florida. Just imagine that. Now, in the beginning of the 17th century, the French had taken Canada. Right, and moving down into Arcadia. The Spanish had taken Florida, moving up through Florida into Georgia, and we moved along into Louisiana and so on. In the middle, beginning of the 17th century, it wasn't taken. No one had said, "Well, this is ours." Two men, Bartholomew Gosnell and Sir Walter Raleigh, remember his name, were explorers. They said, "We will take this land in the name of Queen Elizabeth, and we'll call this land Virginia, after the supposedly Virgin Queen." And that was the start of the 17th century. Now, very, very quickly, a company was formed called the Virginia Company. And the Virginia Company was divided between two separate entities. One based in London, which were large landowners and the aristocracy, and the other based in Plymouth, down in Devon, England, who were primarily fishermen, traders, wanting to get access to produce that already existed, the beavers, the timber, and everything else. Whereas the Londoners, coming as a southerner, the Londoners wanted to expand the land that they had in the Barbados and basically the Caribbean, growing tobacco and this sort of thing, and they wanted large estates where they could grow more large plantations of you name it. Very quickly there was a schism between the two, Londoners and people in the south. The Londoners said, "This is what we want to do, and we really have a totally separate entity, intent, and it's very different from you, from Plymouth, and the Virginia split into two." And so the Londoners took the southern part, which remained called Virginia, and the Plymouth people took up what was called, which became the Council for New England. New England was named a little later on. New England was called New England about 1616 or so by John Smith. So that split caused a problem, because what was needed for the territories to actually take root and become viable entities, they had to be settled. So in 1606, 1607, Jamestown was founded for the Virginia side. Up in various attempts were made by the Council of New England to settle in New England. Couldn't make it. Attempts in Saginaw, Popham Foundation, Popham attempt settlement. There was one in Saco, the Scattergrove, the mouth of where Plymouth is now. All these things tried to, but that didn't work for the Council of New England. And this was becoming increasingly a problem. You have, if you, for one very simple reason, is that you would be taken over, that land would be taken over either by the French from the north, or by the southern Virginia down there, wanting the fish and access to the produce that was coming from the north, which they didn't have in the south. So they needed to have settlement. And Council of New England couldn't find anyone who could get there and settle. So that was a critical problem. Now, in the course of my research, I found some coincidences. One, there was this desperate attempt to get a settlement into New England. And coming up to 1616, 1617 attempts to 1620, still had no settlement. Whereas Jamestown was having difficulties, but they had the settlement, and people were, the settlers there were moving up the Chesapeake, and they were expanding. The French were making noises. People wanted to come from south. They wanted access to fishing, they wanted access to the lumber, they wanted access to the pelts, and there was increasing attempts to infiltrate down from into Maine and so on. So the first thing was that problem. The second problem was that I found is that one of the things that the Council of New England did, is they brought people, Native Americans, Indians, back for training purposes. Train them, learn about how they lived, and teach them English, and send them back with other expeditions to help act as a sort of liaison and interpreters for the tribes that they met back then. I found that for each of the expeditions, one or other of these Native Americans went back with these various expeditions. Miraculously, when the Mayflower arrived in Newburyport, as I call it, there were two of these Native Americans waiting for them. Somerset and Squanto. They had been trained, they knew English, although Somerset didn't. That was the second point. The third point I found rather confusing was that when the Mayflower left Plymouth, England, they all thought they were going to the Hudson, because on the Hudson was a Dutch development, New Amsterdam, had been established between the two Virginias, if you like. They thought they were going there, but somehow they ended up where they did. Another coincidence was that a number of people, a number of explorers, Sam de Champlain had been going down through the early 1760s, 1605, 1608. They had not only explored, but they had mapped the coastline, including Plymouth Harbour, the bottom end of Mass Bay. John Smith had done the same thing. Captain John Smith of Pocahontas fame had done the same thing, and others. So that whole Massachusetts area was very, very well mapped, and it was known exactly where the reefs were, where the inlets were, where the sandbars were, and where the protection was in various harbours and so on. And yet, as far as the world is concerned, the Mayflower arrives at Cape Cod totally by accident. And certainly they worked their way to this, find this harbour that was all there waiting for them, in fact, with people waiting. Well, you can chart it and everything else. And I said, there are too many coincidences here, because by the settlers arriving Separatists, if you like, arriving in that part of New England, it solved the problem with Council of New England. They had to have a settlement. There was a settlement waiting for them. So I said, surely there must have been some kind of persuasion to get the captain of the Mayflower to actually take them to that place to solve the Council of New England's problem. They'd make sure that the Native Americans were there waiting for them so they could provide the service and support that they all did to the new people coming on board. And this would actually solve the problem with the coincidence. Well, why would they? How was it that they didn't go to the Hudson? Went so much. So these were the sort of the conundrums, if you like, that I had from doing my research. And I said, there's a story here, and I'm going to make it fictional because just in case I haven't got it quite right, but I'm going to write a story about what happened. So, the first book. I'm almost done my time already. Oh, can I go on? I mean, stop if I'm getting bored. So, the first book starts, and the first book, you can get some, I don't have very many, I didn't realize so many people could. But there are some books in the store downstairs. The first book, called Exploration. Easy because I've got, you want me to read it, because I've got. And this one starts in 1613. By 1613. By 1613, a number of attempts have been made to settle New England and failed. And they've been driven by a chap called Sir Ferdinando Gorges, one of them. His family come from Normandy with the Normans in 1066, so that's why he had a funny name. But he was the governor of the fort in Plymouth, England, and also the general in charge of the Southwest Approach Defence, which covered south coast of England down to Cornwall and then included up Somerset and Bristol area and so on. So he's a very important person. But he was also very, very anxious as to get New England settled for various reasons, personal reasons and for political reasons. And he was the driving force behind getting all this done. Another person who was very important, by the way, Sir Ferdinando Gorges was called, I think he was called the founder of Maine, where he had been there. Another person who was very important, who was in the story, the real person, was a chap called the Reverend John White, the patriarch, as he was called, and he was the rector of the Holy Trinity Church in Dorchester, in England. And he was very sympathetic to the Puritan cause. He was an Anglican Church of England vicar, lector, but he was very sympathetic to the Puritan cause. By the way, the Puritans were the purifying of the Church of England, but remaining within the Church of England, while the Separatists, which were what we now call pilgrims, who went to England, they wanted to separate entirely from the Church of England. That was the difference. And John White, the patriarch, was basically a Puritan sympathizer. But he was very concerned about what was happening with the religious persecution going on in England at that stage. And it was getting worse and worse. In fact, the Separatists who went on to Mayflower actually left England in 1607 to go to Leiden in Holland. And they set up their own little enclave there. And this is why they thought, because they hadn't been in Leiden in Holland, but when they decided they wanted to leave Holland because they were being too confined and they found the children becoming Dutch and they didn't want that to happen, all the rest of it. But they were then going to go to the Dutch enclave, if you like, in New England. That seemed like a very logical thing to do, and the Dutch were quite happy to go over there and give them land and so on. So, where was I? So by 1613, many things going on, and John White had begun to support and provide support to the people in Leiden, financial support, but also was paying attention to what was going on in Virginia, where they actually had successful settlements. And he was beginning to think, well, maybe we can get these people, other people, to go to New England as well. It seems like land of boundless opportunity. And maybe the people people are having so much problem with the authorities, religious and the king and everyone else, creating pressure on them because they weren't include Church of England people. You get over there. So that was the start of it. Now, 1613, there was a fire in Dorchester. It consumed a significant portion of Dorchester. John White galvanized his forces and got everyone to provide money to support the rebuilding. And at that time he thought, well, if I can raise money for this, perhaps I can also raise money to support people going across to New England. One of the, all sorts of tangled words here. At the same time, going back to Fernando Gorges, I was called, or Surrey, in Plymouth. He was, one of the things he was concerned about was that most of the trade coming through from New England, or North America, not New England, from Canada and so on, was coming through ports like La Rochelle, French traders, French fishermen. And that was a sort of hotspot for them, traders there, to then ship the produce to other places, including the west coast, southwest coast of England. La Rochelle and other countries, towns like that, were Huguenot, French Protestant, in a 99% Catholic France. They'd been given this sort of special dispensation by a previous monarch. The current monarch, actually was a kid, his mother was the regent, said, a pox on these Huguenots, we're going to take them over. And the English tried to support the Huguenots in the little city-states that they had, one of them was La Rochelle. But it was clear that they were going to have some serious problems. And so Sir Ferdinand said, we've got to find our own direct lines into this produce in New England. We can't depend on the French anymore. So another reason he desperately wanted to establish settlements in New England so he could pull the produce back directly into New England. So 1613, fine. Isaac is dallying with having cozies, as I say in the book, with his girlfriend Abby, who is the daughter of a ship's charmer, making candles, stuff like that. Baker did exist. There is no knowledge in the history books of Abby. So Abby is a fictional character who's very much part of the first book. While they're not paying attention to the cauldron of boiling candle wax that they've been asked to look after by the father, because they were doing something else, found the thing overflowed and suddenly there was a conflagration, which is actually what happened, conflagration. And that resulted in fire spreading through to most of, well, a third of Dorchester was burned down. Isaac, thinking he was responsible, essentially escapes, pursued as he thought by an angry crowd, not the case. He ends up being put on a boat to, believe it or not, La Rochelle. What a coincidence. Where, in fact, Sir Ferdinand has some spies trying to find out what's going on. And Isaac gets involved in that spying activity. He suddenly becomes, by the way, in telling the story, I knew that I'd have quite a long period of time to write about it. I was thinking up to about 1635. So I had to start with Isaac being quite young. I didn't want him to die before the end of the story. so he's 16 years old when we start. He's very well developed, very mature. Anyway, he goes to sea, and then the story begins and starts unraveling the plot about La Rochelle, about what's going on, what Sir Ferdinand Gorges is trying to do to establish the settlements, and how the intrigue behind ultimately getting the Separatists on the Mayflower to go to Plymouth, New Plymouth, as opposed to the Dutch New Amsterdam in Hudson River, and so on. So the first book then is very much about that. The second book starts with the Mayflower leaving Plymouth to go to New Plymouth. So it's just a continuation. And that's really about how the history is how the attempts to establish a governing structure in New England after the Puritans arrived, up to the time, essentially, that John Endicott comes in as governor of Salem, and to be followed very closely thereafter by John Winthrop, 1630, the Great Migration. The third book, which I've just finished the first draft of, starts where the second book, Retribution, finishes and continues on with Endicott arriving in Salem and his issues, and then Winthrop arriving shortly afterwards. And by that time, Isaac has become a successful businessman. It's more and more about his family and how they grew up and everything else. And that ends, I thought it was going to end in 1635, but it actually ends beginning of 1632. And those are the three stories. And it's, I think, 35 minutes. Any questions?
Could you read a piece?
Oh, sure.
Yeah, if you're ready. Is that all right with everybody?
For me to say no. What I'll do is I'll read the very first one is I said that. I know what it is. I need glasses. Desperate to see things. Right. This first one is basically with Isaac being caught. Okay. On August the 9th, the patriarch, John White, sent me to get some more church candles from old man Baker. Abby was in the kitchen preparing a meal. I took advantage to share it. Old man Baker came in and told Abby he had a big cauldron of tallow being heated in the shop. He had to go to make a delivery, so he told her to watch the fire and keep it stoked. After he left, Abby and I went to check the fire. Alone in the shop together, we quickly settled down for some cozies. Next thing I knew, Abby was screaming in my ear, leaping to her feet. The cauldron had boiled over and tallow was in the fire. The fire exploded, walls quickly lighting. We were like madmen trying to beat out the flames with anything to hand. I was running out to find water and help just as Abby's father came back, yelling at me for burning his shop down. In the street, I bounced off David Porter, who had seen the smoke. By this time, the flames were already to the roof. Bingham's shop was alight. Porter grabbed me and shouted, "Shit, gunpowder!" He dragged me next door to the shower hall and said, "Get sacks, wet them, and help me move the barrels quick before they blow us all up." I froze terrified, but Porter, cool-headed, grabbed some sacks that were stacked against the wall, pushed them into my hands, pointed to the horse trough, and slapped me on the shoulder. By this time, the smoke was intense, and fire had made it to the roof of the warehouse. I stumbled to the trough and wet the sacks, feeling I was in some waking dream state. Didn't have time to think. Sacked to a barrel, wrapped and rolled out the door. Someone, I couldn't see who, helped me lift the barrel into a cart. I went back to the next one. Porter was doing the same. So that's the start of the process. Then there's a lot of sailing. Being a sailor 35, 40 years, I always take every opportunity I can to write about sailing, especially 17th century sailing, and getting to understand how it works, rigging, and what it's like to sail. So there's a lot of sailing in sailing descriptions in here. There's one little piece here which is descriptive, I suppose. It's, until sail had to be shortened, Rosie, which is the name of the sweet rose, moved through the water like a coursing hound, eager and happy, with a good heel and spray flying. The roar of the waves raced past the hull, occasionally down the lee scuppers, and I heard the constant snapping of lines on mast, the crack of sails and the wind whistling through the rigging. As darkness fell, the glow from the navigation lights gave the white maelstrom the appearance of a raging sea monster attempting to board us. Brushed aside, he growled his frustration. That's another. Then there was I wanted to talk a little bit about how it was to be a Native American or an Indian brought to England to be taught what's going on. And there's a piece here which said, and this man is called Epinal, and Epinal was a real chieftain based in, it's called Mapawat here, but it was Martha's Vineyard, on the Martha's Vineyard. And he was captured, and then he went back, he escaped, and became an enemy of the English. He was one of the people that tried to fight against the English coming in. He and Squanto fought each other, one pro-English and the other anti-English. Anyway, this is a fictional discussion. That's Isaac and Epinal said, we talked about his feeling toward England and the English coming to his country. His country was huge and beautiful with unlimited resources. People lived well, looked after their land and each other. It was a perfect existence. Then he came to England and saw more people in an hour than he'd seen in his whole life. If England was more like London than the countryside, where we were, then he was terrified of that teeming mass of humanity flowing like a huge wave over his land. England is powerful and wealthy, yet it has terrible poverty, the like of which he could never have imagined. Why is England unable to feed its own people? He sees Wraxall Court and other huge residences owned by single families. He sees palaces in London and people dressed and living in incredible luxury. All of it surrounded by people with nothing but the stench and diseases of their lives. Even in Clerkenwell, miles outside London, the smell of London was gagging. The spectre of death from malnutrition or disease sat on every shoulder. It was a sobering judgment. So that's, again, I'm very cautious of my time. Any questions? I've got to go read forever. Yes?
I'm trying to confirm my high school history of what happened when the Pilgrims came here. I was told because of pandemics that the natives were, for all practical purposes, non-existent on the Cape any longer, and that part of what happened with the Pilgrims that they found stashes of food left behind by the natives. Is that any of that true?
That is true. When they first arrived, they did arrive on Cape Cod before they went into Plymouth. In 1617, 1618, so 2 years earlier, there had been the epidemic, which had wiped out 75–80% of the Native Americans all the way down the coastline, right the way down to including Cape Cod.
What do you think the estimate of the total native population was in New England before that happened?
It was reckoned about 100,000 or more.
And it shrunk to what? What did it shrink to?
It's very difficult to tell because a lot of them moved away. It didn't all die out. They said, we've got to get out of here. They all moved away. They moved inland. That's all of them. They think it was down to about 10,000, 15,000. But mostly it been denuded because they said, we can't deal with this. We need to go somewhere where there isn't the sickness. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I think your numbers have been contested by other research, but there was some research that has shown that there were a lot more than 100,000.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's the case.
Well, I also had a question for you. When you were talking about the Europeans kind of wanting to get settlers, to North America, where are the Portuguese? Because my understanding was that the Portuguese were already here fishing,
They were. They're coming out of these halls.
Or whatever, and that the water, you had said that.
They were actually
Smith and other people had mapped the harbors, but I thought that the Portuguese before them.
The Portuguese were mostly further south. First of all, they're in Brazil and South America and on the north coast of South America, but also into the Caribbean. They had no settlement as such on the North American continent, like the actual coastline. there, but they infiltrated in through fishing. A lot of fishermen coming, but they were coming in as individual fishing ships. And like Gloucester, for example, became a very strong Portuguese fishing community. No actual settlement in the north, as far as I know.
So would this be considered historical fiction? Mostly historical, less fiction?
I once actually asked Andy Smith this question. I said, "And what is historical fiction?" And we had both writers of historical fiction. It was also whatever you want to make of it. And I went elsewhere, and I went online to various historical fiction sort of websites and things, and even into Facebook, when they have Facebook entities. And the general consensus was, and it seemed to be mostly from readers of historical fiction rather than writers, is that anything that's more than 50 years old is historical. Okay, so what makes it fiction, a fictional factual, or a factual fiction, or a, in other words, how much fiction does there have to be for it cease to being factual and becomes fiction? That is such a sort of philosophical discussion. I'm just covering myself by saying that if I put anything in there which isn't true, like, for example, Isaac Stanfield was clearly not true. He's a fictional narrator, and he puts into the mouths of vast numbers of people conversations that he has, entirely fictional, but relevant to the subject that's being described. I mean, actually, this is something else. I have a total aside, I apologize. But not being a writer, I found it extraordinary that fairly early on, as I was actually writing the book, that I was sitting down at my keyboard saying, "Okay, Isaac, what happens next?" And Isaac was telling me what was going on, and I was just writing what he was telling me. And I asked other authors this, and he said, it's like a sort of being in the zone with playing golf or anything. You're not really part of it. Are you Isaac or is Isaac you? What's going on? And I was in this, and you're writing, and you come out of this sort of daze, and you start reading down through what it was, and you say, oh, God, I didn't think of that. So, yeah, it's fiction. With a dose of historical reality.
Yes. Well, you said when you started the trilogy, it ended up being, you envisioned it going to 1635, and it will now go as far as 1632.
That's right.
So you have had a, other than a year, you have a conclusion in mind, how this is going to play out, or you have thought?
I have.
You do.
I have, but again, Isaac took over.
So we shall see.
The problem was that I was so intrigued, or Isaac was so busy telling me what was going on, that I got through, I was into about 200 pages, and I only got through the first year, or something, whatever it was. I said, Isaac, come on, go. Let's speed up. But the original intent, yes, exactly. The original intent was, the reason I write the journal is because Isaac had a very good friend he was at school with, who was a real person, a chap called Will Whiteway. And Will Whiteway was a resident of Dorchester, and he became a member of Parliament and a very important citizen in England, a real person. And when Isaac first left, in fact, that first bit I wrote to you about having cozies with Abby was in the form of a letter to Will. Because Will had said, when you go, what happened? You've disappeared. What's going on? And he wrote back saying, well, this is what happened. And Will then said, after a couple of letters, which are in here, Will said, write the journal. I'm stuck in Dorchester. I'm living a boring, bureaucratic life. You're having all these adventures. I want to relive those adventures. Write to me and tell me what you're doing so I can live them with you. And Will Whiteway dies in 1635. So my intent was that I would write through, and then when Isaac finds that the reason for writing the journal is gone, that would be a logical end. But Isaac had other ideas.
So I want to say say that I have read the book this past week,
Oh, yeah.
and that Isaac gets into terrifying situations, gut-wrenching. I mean, I had to put the book down. I can't stand it any minute more. Isaac is a bestseller. It's just such a thriller. I mean, that Isaac, he really did take charge.
Well, I was told, I've actually had to tone it down a little bit. Yeah, because, well, certainly some of the scenes with Abby were probably slightly needed to tone down a bit. Less informed, I kept saying. The other thing was that the actual injuries that he suffered, he said,
Yes.
how many times is the guy going to get concussed? How many times is he going to be seriously damaged? My problem was that I played an awful lot of rugby at school, and right up to the time I was 30, I'd been concussed, every other week almost. So the idea of those sorts of injuries didn't really mean much. That's my background as well. A lot of people who haven't gone through that kind of sporting endeavour perhaps would say, this is a little too much. To me it wasn't. Yes?
Well, as I was reading, of course, being from New England, I was really struggling with the geography. Like, where's Georgia?
Oh, right.
But I did take a look at the map. But it made me wonder if you were from that area, because the author seems to know the countryside so well.
Yes. That was an indulgence, I'm afraid. I love the southwest of England. It's a very beautiful part of the world. Even more beautiful then. I actually come from Yorkshire. Spent all my time down in the south. And yes, I really enjoyed it. The other thing I did enjoy very much was actually talking about the pubs. Many of the pubs that are referenced in the book are still there. Or if they're not there, they were certainly were there in recent history for me to do a write. They were real. Every one of the pubs that I referenced were if not real now, I mean, they're still around. They certainly were at the time. So, yes, that whole area, I love writing about it. Sorry, Jack.
Yeah, I think for me, the depth that you got into for Surfer Nando Gorgeous, who was like, that's not an English thing, it's like more Spanish. But yeah, I've heard of him, I knew a little bit about him. Maine actually was the other side of this river when he owned it, so, but he never visited. Just all the detail you added and filled in on his role in the settlement of New England was fascinating.
Yeah, he's very much a part of the story. Yes.
So I'm curious about the Native Americans being taken to England to be educated, or, I mean, did they go willingly? Did they have a gun in the back of their head? Or did they want to go? Or?
No, they were kidnapped. A lot of it happened, well, the whole series, I started off quite a long story, I'll keep it very short. There was 5 or 6 Native Americans who were captured at the orders of Sir Ferdinand orders. They were captured and kidnapped and forcibly taken aboard and brought back with the specific purpose of finding out what was going on amongst the tribes in North America, learning the language, getting them to learn English, and then taking them back to the guys. And those 5 or 6 were the key players in a lot of the subsequent research. Subsequent to that, piracy was becoming a terrible problem. And well, piracy here too. You name it, I've got it. It's in the book, and it's all there. But the piracy became a terrible scourge. And a lot of pirates focused very much on the capture of people, for them to be taken to the Mediterranean and sold to the Turks, the Arabs, for them to put on their ships if they're men, rowing the galleys and things, and then they died areas of malnutrition, starvation, or if they're women, they were taken to the harems and lead servants, or whatever it would be. So anywhere where there was an opportunity to sell slaves, sell people to become slaves, sell people to become whatever, they would take advantage of. So what happened later on was that Native Americans were being captured, brought back, and then sold into the Mediterranean places. So it was, while the original intent was to do what we just discussed, it extended to becoming a much more serious problem. In fact, piracy was something like 1.5 million Christians, quote unquote, were captured by corsary pirates and the rest and sold into slavery or whatever it might be, including pirates would raid the coasts of England, of Ireland, and capture whole villages and take them back. And again, in this story, it tells about there was a society. There's a thing called the Mercenary Society, which is a Catholic order, a Catholic order, which was established to try and barter for Christian slaves, sell or get them to get the pirates to sell the captured seamen or whoever they were, if they're Christians, especially if they're Catholic Christians, and exchange for money, and then they would be repatriated. And in fact, what's not known but is actually found in public history is that Squanto, a big statue of him in Plymouth, he was captured by one of these rogue English traders and taken to be sold as a slave in Mediterranean. And the Separatists society, they found him and they managed to get him back. And Isaac, on one of his trips, goes to Malaga and Spain, and helps rescue him back. And that's just bringing that part of the overall story about the scourge of piracy and how much it meant in terms of the deprivations to the commercial life and personal life of so many people in Europe. Yes?
The write-up, the museum's write-up of your talk, I think said something about a Merrimac River connection, or...
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Related to that? Can you
I'm sure. Actually, I'll have a sort of tea break and I'll start again. Yes, what I found was that I love the whole shoreline of Merrimac. And what I wanted to do was when Isaac arrived with his family to settle, he wanted to get out of the way. He arrived in 1628, he wanted to get out of the way before the great rush of the Great Migration. So he said, we've got to get out of here, being Salem and the Boston area. And he explores up the coastline and then comes down the Merrimac River, and he finds his way to some big cliffs on the left, the stream just beyond, and he goes up there and says, this is a fabulous place to go. And it's actually the Maudslay Estate. And he comes in the stream, which is the Archer River. It's not, well, that's another part of research. It was thought that Samuel Champlain had done a survey and named it the Archer because of the yellow flowers, the yellow sunflowers on the tubers tasted like Archer. But I found nothing in my research that said that Samuel Champlain had actually done that. So I called it a slightly different name in the book, only because we had to give it a name in the book rather than calling about the stream by the Merrimac. But he settles and he establishes a farm on the Maudslay Estate. And there's again the third book describes the establishment of that farm and what happens. Yeah.
Speaking of that subject for a couple of minutes, have you ever heard the term the king's trees?
No.
Well, how it was described to me was that the English came here, went up the Merrimac, and put little plaques on trees to indicate that they belonged to the king. Is that true?
No idea. No idea.
Yeah, I think it's massive.
What year was that?
That's definitely true, I've read that.
Sorry?
That's definitely true,
What sort of year, what time frame are we talking about?
fairly early, before the revolution, obviously.
Well, if it was after 1635, I wouldn't have talked about it anyway.
I've read it in many sources.
But I don't know.
Let's see, one more question?
Yeah.
This is more of a technical research question. So you had talked about you saw documents maybe with Cambridge or Harvard, where you have to be faculty or subscribe.
Oh, yes.
Where did you go to find those documents? I'm very.
It's one of these things where how the hell did I get here? You delve, you follow things down, you go into them, and it's like cascading down into it, and suddenly you find yourself in this sort of treasure trove. And then you grab the information, and then you go somewhere else, and you say, no, I need to go back there. I don't know how I
Well, I'm going through that, so
I don't know how to get there. Very frustrating. So what I learned to do is, well, if I find a place, grab it and take the information you want, because you might never find it again. But I'm very much an amateur researcher, and I'm sure professional researchers will be disgusted about my approach to it. There you go. All right, okay, good.
Thank you very much.